Who made the anonymous report about Milchick? Was there a mistake in Irving's banner? What did Ben Stiller say about the whistled song in this episode? We'll cover these questions and more in this video. Welcome to Square Eyes, a channel where we recap, review and take a sideways look at your favourite TV shows. This video will look at episode 5 of season 2 of Severance. It's called Trojan's Horse. Let's jump straight into the recap. The episode starts with a man whistling a tune as he pushes his trolley into the optics and design storage area. He picks up a delivery of surgical-looking equipment and wheels it away. He then takes these items in the lift to what Felicia calls the exports hall, but we were introduced to as the lift to the testing floor. After the credits, we see Mark taking a host of pills and some questionable-looking gloop, which he must have been prescribed by Dr. Agabi. Mark is on the phone to his sister, Devon, and tells her how Lumon told him that his innie fell off a rope. They both know this isn't true, even if they don't know really what happened to him on the weekend away. We also find out that he hasn't told his sister about reintegrating when she asks her how his light bulb plan is going. The call is cut short by Dr. Agabi coming up from Mark's basement, where she's living while he's going through reintegration. There's a bit of friction between them, as Mark doesn't want her to live in his house and wants her to rush through the reintegration process, while Agabi explains that she has to live in his house because coming back and forth to manage his reintegration would raise suspicions. Back at the Lumon offices, Helena Egan has a meeting with Natalie and Mr. Drummond. Helena seems to have recovered from Irving nearly drowning her at the end of the last episode. She wants to know who's going to tell her father about the Ortbow, but Mr. Drummond has decided not to burden him with this information, which adds an interesting layer to things, as clearly Drummond is doing this to conceal a series of errors that have led to Helena being dunked in the water. Mr. Drummond appears to show concern for Helena and suggests she has another obligement session. I have no idea what this means, but judging by how quickly Helena says she doesn't need one, it's probably not a nice thing. Natalie and Drummond then inform Helena that Helly will have to go back to the 7th floor to help Mark complete his Cold Harbour file. Helena wants to fake it again and go down herself, but the other two tell her that she can't risk it. Helena seems genuinely scared about sending Irony back down again after she tried to kill her last season, and Irving's shenanigans at the end of the last episode. She describes innies as animals, and has a sort of disgusted look on her face, which is odd because she didn't seem to mind innies so much when she was in the tent with Mark in the last episode. Helena isn't happy, but Drummond emphasises how the work is mysterious and important, as well as telling her that her father encouraged this course of action. From Helena's point of view, her father has chosen completing the Cold Harbour file over her safety. While she's obviously taking this rejection hard, she's also trying to keep a lid on her emotions in the boardroom. We then see Helena switch to Helly in the lift, and she looks ready for a fight as the elevator doors open. Miss Wong is there to greet Helly as she comes out of the elevator, which freaks her out a little bit. They both go see Milchick, and we can see from Helly's walk that she's back for real. Helly storms into Milchick's office and demands answers straight away, which again shows the difference between her and Helena, who was reluctant to go in a goat tunnel last week. Mark and Dylan follow Helly in, and they have their own questions for Milchick, mostly about the fact that Helly has been Helena ever since the overtime contingency last season. Helly is stunned and disgusted to hear that her outie has taken her place. Understandably, she feels violated that her outie has assumed her identity, though she'd be even more upset if she knew what happened on the Ortbow. Dylan also demands to know where Irving is. Milchick tries to calm the waters by explaining Helena was doing valuable research, and Irving's outie is on an elongated cruise voyage. The innie sees straight through Milchick's explanation, so he pivots into a story about the Glacksheepen, a Swedish folktale about how the king would go amongst his people in disguise to find out their problems. Milchick alleges that Helena was carrying out this tradition. Again, the outies aren't impressed by the story. Milchick, clearly irritated about having to concede the point, admits that Irving isn't coming back. They then accuse Milchick and Lumon of being murderers. Back in the MDR department, the desks have been changed to a tri-station to fit 3 people around them rather than 4. The MDR team all hate this new setup, presumably because they don't want Irving to be forgotten so easily, though he's already been photoshopped out of the team photos on their desks. Dylan, despite being warned about privileges being withdrawn if he keeps talking, says that he wants a funeral for Irving. Milchick clearly doesn't want this to happen, but asks Mark if that's what the team want. Mark is distracted, and agrees eventually to the funeral, but only if it's quick. This seems weird of Mark, like he isn't being himself, but there's nothing much more to go on to prove it at this stage. We then see Mark coughing, which in TV and film is usually an early warning that a character is about to be very unwell. Helly then joins Mark in the bathroom while Mark is looking confused. She wants to know what had gone on with Helena, and why he didn't know it wasn't her. Mark seems to be going through a crisis, brought on by knowing that an Egan has been spying on everything he's been doing. Helly wants to plot and share information, but Mark seems defeated and shuts her down. Then Mr. Milchick and Miss Wong are in the back office, preparing everything they need for Irving's funeral. Miss Wong is critical of Milchick's decision to allow the funeral. She thinks it'll make them feel like people. Milchick is clearly not liking his subordinate question his judgment, but when he complains about her unsolicited opinions, she reminds him of his upcoming performance review, hinting that he's in trouble. This gives us a suggestion that Miss Wong is a skilled operator in Lumon office politics, despite being only a child. The funeral is as weird as everything else Lumon does. There's a Nintendo Entertainment System style animation of Bert bowing in front of a red curtain. Milchick leads a moment of silence. Dylan speaks kindly about Irving, and it's quite a touching moment. There isn't much time to reflect on this, as the melon sculpture of Irving's head is rolled in. Miss Wong is about to burst into a theremin solo when Milchick pulls her out. This goes down badly with her, but Milchick isn't having any of her complaints. Mark then leaves Irving's wake with indecent speed. He's acting like he doesn't care about Irving. As an act of retaliation, Dylan tells Helly that Mark is married to Miss Casey. Helly follows Mark out, and we find out that the reason for Mark's malaise is because Lumon are smarter than them. Mark's plans are now all scuppered by Helena most likely leaking them to the management. He's also not completely sure if he's talking to Helly or Helena, though it's pretty obvious from her behaviour and body language that it is the real Helly. Before Milchick goes into his performance review, he asks Natalie what she thought of the diversified gear paintings she received. He wants to connect with her about being a minority and working for Lumon. Natalie does that thing again, of saying a lot with her eyes and facial expressions without actually saying anything with her mouth. Her mask slips for a second, but then she quickly slips back into business mode and the opportunity to bond is gone for them. Over at Irving's wake, Dylan is the only one left, and he remembers that the final words that Irving said to him were "hang in there." Dylan checks the poster with this written on it and finds a note with directions and Irving's sketch on it. Mr. Drummond conducts Milchick's performance review. There are a few positives, but the focus of the meeting is on the 3 contentions anonymously reported against him. It's almost certain that the anonymous person is Miss Wong. Milchick's 3 big mistakes are that he's used too many big words, he's used paperclips incorrectly, and then the fact that he's made terrible decisions since his promotion. While big words and paperclip errors can be forgiven, hopeless job performance seems to be a problem, particularly as his blunders on the Ortbow nearly cost an Egan their life. Drummond explains to Milchick that Mark completing the Cold Harbour file will be one of humanity's greatest achievements. He thinks they're getting close to such a huge milestone as affecting Milchick's judgment, and he should go back to basics. It seems obvious the message here is that Milchick has been too soft and needs to toughen up with the innies. Milchick doesn't seem that impressed with the feedback he's received, which has also been written up in a glossy brochure for him to take away. Regardless, he tells Drummond that he's going to tighten the leash. While this is going on, Mark continues to work on his file. He is suddenly struck with a pain in his head. This is coupled with a visual disturbance, where his team photo flickers away and is replaced by 3 pills and then returns again. The pills are the same ones that his outie was taking off the counter earlier in the episode. It's only a brief thing though, and Mark comes back to himself and shuts down his PC for the day to go home. To show that he's tightening the leash, Milchick catches Mark in the lift. When Mark gets sassy with him, Milchick gets up in his face and tells him he knows what Mark did with Helly's outie on the Ortbow. Then Devon is reading a draft of Rickon's reworded book that he's writing for the innies. While the writing has his usual flowery style, he's changed the meaning to suit Lumon's company policy. Devon points out that he's now saying the opposite of what he's written before, and Rickon defends himself by suggesting that his writing could spark a revolution among the innies, despite the fact that he's just writing up company policy. Devon then suggests that working for an evil company makes you sort of evil too, and Rickon hears what she's saying, but points out that the money on offer is basically too good to turn down, showing that his values are pretty much worthless and he's happy to sell out to the highest bidder. Then we see Irving go back to the phone box we saw him use in episode 2. He's talking to his contact about being fired by Lumon when he spots Bert watching him from his car. He confronts Bert and asks him why he's been following him, and Bert explains that Irving turned up on his doorstep screaming his name, so he wanted to know more about who was doing it and why. Bert explains that he was canned by Lumon because his innie had an unsanctioned erotic entanglement. Bert's husband, Fields, believes that Irving was the person that he was having the entanglement with, and as a consequence cancelled their trip to Milwaukee. Bert invites Irving for tea with him and Fields the next night, so they can talk everything over. When Bert offers Irving a lift home, he adds that he knows where he lives. Irving refuses the offer and moves on, but there's something about this last interaction that makes me suspicious of Bert. I'm not convinced he's as innocent in all this as we're led to believe. Churagabi and Mark continue their prickly conversations, with Mark pushing to keep doing the reintegration treatment, but Ragabi wanting to go slowly. Mark goes up the stairs to leave and hears someone talking to him about his outie. It's not Ragabi talking though, it's Gemma. Gemma continues to tell him facts about his outie, in the style of the wellness sessions we saw Miss Casey give last season. Alongside this, Mark is now walking through the corridors of the 7th floor. After a while he turns around to see Gemma, or actually Miss Casey, talking to him. She says that his outie is going to be... but we cut back to the outside world before we find out the answer. The episode closes on Mark's reaction to seeing his wife alive again. After the dramatic events of the last episode, it makes sense that this episode would be a bit more low-key and work through the fallout of the Ortbow. Even though it didn't have huge moments in it, there's still a lot to like about this episode. In some ways, seeing the reactions in this episode was more interesting and revealing than seeing the actual events take place in the last episode. It was possible that spending time among the innies might have softened Helena Regan's views on them, but the way she dismisses them as animals in this episode suggests that she's got nothing but contempt for them, explaining why she didn't do a better job of pretending to be Helly. She saw them as subhuman, so didn't think she'd have to try all that hard to trick them. Helly's reaction to having her innie life hijacked by her outie seemed absolutely correct. As an innie, the 7th floor is all she's got to experience. Relentless work forever, but at least that's her life, but even that's been taken from her now. I'm pleased in a way that she hasn't found out about Mark's tent time with Helena on the Ortbow, this might have been too much for her to take at this point. Though surely she'll find out eventually, and it's likely to throw a spanner in the works with her relationship with Mark. It was interesting to see a Lumon version of a funeral in this episode. I'm not sure I'd want a giant melon carved into the shape of my head, which is then eaten by the mourners, but every culture deals with death differently, I suppose. I think we've seen a lot more depth to Dylan's character in this season. He was initially introduced in Season 1 as a foul-mouthed man who only cares about earning perks. In this episode we saw someone that had lost someone they sincerely cared about, despite the fact sincerity doesn't come easily to Dylan. I liked how Milchick tried to put Dylan back in his box by threatening to remove access to his wife in the visitation centre, and Dylan kept speaking out anyway, showing a level of selflessness and devotion to Irving that you might not have expected. Mark's innie didn't seem nearly as invested in Irving's departure, and was often sidetracked in this episode. At first I thought it was because his outie had taken over, but it seemed like it was really because he was so devastated that Helena had been posing as Helly all this time, and his schemes and wishes were all being exposed. He most likely also felt pretty violated by Helena pretending to be Helly when they got together in the tent last episode. It's not yet completely clear how reintegration is going to work for Mark. It seems like at the moment it works in brief flashes of the two selves overlapping, but will increase as the treatment continues. The scene we saw at the end had a strange, almost dreamlike quality to it. For example, Miss Casey or Gemma couldn't have been on the severed floor, but she's now on the testing floor. However, seeing her in this vision seemed enough to convince outie Mark that Gemma is still alive. For all the mysteries and wild theories that they create, Severance is still a well-observed workplace drama, so seeing Milchick get pulled over the coals in his performance review felt like it was pulled from real life. Even though he gets pulled up for his word choices and paperclip usage seemed exactly like the kind of pettiness that you often see in offices. Milchick is also suffering with the classic problem of all middle managers, in that he's getting grief from above and below him. His bosses are being openly critical of him, and those below him are not doing what they should do. Innies were abusive to Milchick all the way through this episode, and Miss Wong clearly betrayed him as the anonymous person who described his shortfalls to Drummond and Natalie. I was a bit surprised to hear Mr. Drummond describe all the reforms for the Innies as Milchick's ideas. I expected that these decisions that made big changes to how the Innies are looked after would come from above, but it looks like it was all him. Even if other people were involved with these reforms, it's clear that Milchick is now getting the blame for them. Sadly for Milchick, his desire to treat the Innies more decently has backfired, and he's now under pressure. We've already seen with his confrontation with Mark in the lift that he meant it when he said he was going to tighten the leash. Even the choice of phrasing is revealing, as he sees the Innies as animals that need to be tamed and kept on a short leash. My feeling about Milchick is that he might actually, on some level, be a good person who wants to take care of the Innies, but he's also an ambitious person and wants to succeed, so there's a conflict going on there. It was a bad episode for Milchick, but there was one thing that strengthened his position. He knows what Helena and Mark did on the Ortbo. My guess would be that he's going to sit on this information as a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card, and then they'll use it as either a tool to motivate Mark to finish his file, or as a way to blackmail Helena. As I mentioned earlier, this was a slightly less dramatic episode, but there was still loads of stuff to enjoy. The story's starting to really get going now, and most of the various mysteries presented in the show keep getting nudged along with every episode. It's just hard to wait a week between each episode for the next update. My favourite line in this episode came from Milchick in his office when he said, "This went well," after his meeting with the MDR team objectively went terribly. He was shouted at, sworn at, and accused of being a murderer, and these aren't typically signs of a meeting that's gone well. Milchick's sunny disposition in the face of hostility is one of his better qualities, but it's also one of the things that makes him scary too. The banner at Irving's funeral said that he'd been with them from quarter 870 to quarter 882. This suggests that he's been with the MDR team for 3 years. However, a couple of years ago, Apple TV did some marketing on LinkedIn that showed Bert had been with the company for 9 years. This is borne out by his unique employee code on his badge, as they run sequentially, with the longest serving employees having the lowest number. If this is true, what did Irving do in those other 6 years? Could that explain why his outie knows that the lift to the testing floor is significant? Maybe that's where the Innies have their memories wiped before they're redeployed. Also, the quarter running up to 882 suggests that the company has been around for 220 years or so. However, the company history that we saw in Season 1 said that Keir Regan started as the first CEO of Lumon in 1865, which is around 160 years ago. This discrepancy could just be a plot hole, but it suggests that time isn't quite what we're used to inside Lumon. In episode 1 of this season, we saw a blurry figure in the hallway behind Innie Mark when he first arrived back on the 7th floor. Could this have been the reverse shot of outie Mark wandering the halls at the end of this episode? I felt certain it was when I was watching episode 5, but when I went back to episode 1, the figure looks to be wearing a shirt and tie and not the jumper we see outie Mark wearing. Who was the person at the start of the episode who collected the surgical equipment from the optics and design team? Clever camera work meant that his face was hidden throughout his scene, but IMDb has given us a small spoiler. The character pushing the cart is credited as the Doctor, and he's listed as appearing in all 5 episodes that are remaining in the season. My first thought was that this character might be an Innie version of Fields, Bert's husband, but we saw Fields in the finale of the last season, and this guy is not him. The song this man was whistling at the start of the episode was The Wreck of Edmund Fitzgerald by Gordon Lightfoot. You could scour the lyrics for deeper meaning in this song about a shipwreck on a lake, but Ben Stiller has already talked about this song. In an interview with the New York Times in January 2025, He said there was no great conspiracy linking this song to Lumon's intentions. When he was asked, he said, "I'm just a Gordon Lightfoot fan. I'll hopefully always be able to use his music because I think he's one of the greatest artists of all time." When Milchick and Wong are getting ready for Irving's funeral, we see in the back office shelving that Mark, Helly and Dylan also have mugs with their faces on them. This suggests to me that the company has already planned for everyone's funeral in advance. I love how much story there is still to get through in this season. We know that Irving is going to eat a ham with Bert and Fields, most likely in the next episode. Mark is pushing to speed up his reintegration process, even though we're seeing early signs of his health failing. Helly doesn't know that Mark slept with a rowdy, but Milchick does and might not keep his lips closed for long, particularly as Milchick has promised to tighten the leash on the innies, even though he also looks to be getting fed up with his employer, so he could go either way. There's also Miss Cobell, who's out there somewhere and I suspect she'll come back into the story later on. And of course there's Rickon's work, translating his book for innies, though I'm starting to wonder if the company are working with Rickon just to keep tabs on the family. And obviously there's the show's biggest mysteries, like what's going on with Gemma. What is the Cold Harbour file really, and why is it so important? And what are they doing with the goats? Hopefully we'll get nearer to answers as the season unfolds. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Goodbye.